30s were the Great Depression, World War II, of course, devastating. And the point is, by the end of World War II, Britain had basically gone deeply into debt, even with its own colonies, which became independent countries. And so Britain never quite got out of debtor status again. And it was a very, very heavy, long, painful period. Britain, the center of the world, going to the new International Monetary Fund for an emergency loan. I mean, unthinkable. But the United States, can you imagine going to the IMF for a loan? It's not impossible. This is exactly what you're referring to.
Absolutely, I remember it. I was in London, of course, when it happened. I can remember the Chancellor turning back at the airport, and he had to rush off to Washington to raise funds. And of course, the fact that we had this currency, which was still an international currency, was doing immense damage to the British domestic economy, which I think people don't understand. So in some ways, it might actually be better for the United States, I would have thought, to go through it quickly than have it, drawn out in the way that it was with Britain. I'm not, by the way, saying that's going to happen, and I'm not making those points. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. If it's a long process, it's a long agony. It's not based on the British experience.
So we will have non-dollar payments in the BRICS. That's clearly high on the mind, not only of President Putin, obviously, but also President Lula, who every day asks, and he's the chair of the G20 this year, as well as being a BRICS member, why are we dealing with Russia in dollars, for heaven's sake? And he's very sensible, very logical, and we will move to new payments arrangements, and they will do just fine, thank you. That will be the real lesson. Corruption by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the U.S. system, because otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And I think currently another problem with the U.S. is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. The counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States.
So, excellent point. Basically, there are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States, because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide. They want their benefits without saying, you see, I run the government. So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually. And so it takes some effort. But as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University working together, discussing and so forth. somehow making such projects, both the economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather
Right.
than to really educate them.
Yeah, and the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, uh, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight, because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future, and we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. Uh, don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world.
Extent of their consequences can have been seen. And then what's wonderful about Smith in the Scottish Enlightenment is he points out that while this was generally a beneficial fact to unite the world, it was disastrous for the native inhabitants of the East and West Indies, he says, because he says that they were relatively weak at the time. He didn't understand that they also brought pathogens of the old world to the Americas that wiped out the population. So Smith could not have understood that, but he did understand conquest. And he said something incredibly humane at the end, which I think marks him as one of the great thinkers of modern times. He said, hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. But nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. So what Smith is saying is, in the future, there's going to come an equality because trade is going to carry knowledge, technological improvement, and an equality of force. Basically, we are 250 years after Smith's writing, and that prediction has come true now. So Smith was in the middle of a 500-year period. 500 years ago, Asia in the lead and the center of gravity and in the technological lead. Europe becomes the agent of change. The steam engine, a reflection of that, not something that came out of the blue, but came out of Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and empire. But it came out of a Glasgow workshop, the condenser on James Watt's steam engine. And there came a new European and North Atlantic-led world. But as Adam Smith said, eventually trade will rebalance, and that's the convergence that we're seeing now. So Watt's steam engine, historians are right to say that what was so fundamental about the steam engine is that it broke the organic barrier of the traditional economy, because basically almost all energy of the primary energy of the pre-James Watt economy was organic. What you could feed to human beings for their labor and what you could feed to the animals for animal traction, plus a little bit of wind and a little bit of water. But basically an organic economy, and we moved to a fossil fuel economy, and that let loose the ability to do work of an unimaginable scale. So everything changed with the fossil fuel breakthrough in the last 2.5 centuries. And of course, Europe got there first, and Britain got there first of the first. And in the geopolitics, we ended up with the British world. This is a map of a wonderful book, The Countries Never Invaded by Britain. Those are the ones in white. Britain went out and just beat the shit out of everybody. And really nasty, by the way. Nasty. In 1839, showed up in China and saying, you have to import our opium. No, we don't want your opium. You don't want our opium? We'll beat the hell out of you. That was the first Opium War. It was followed by the second Opium War. No scruples at all. Sorry to say. So that's power. That's the power of one-sided industrialization. And it conquered much of the world. Long story, and I won't go into it, but the baton was passed to the younger Anglo-American kid brother in 1945, the great Anglo-Saxon handoff, and the US became the next empire. And the idea was that we would dot the world with 800 military bases around the world, and Henry Luce made the sweetest love song to American leaders, telling them this is the American century. That is always captivating. It was captivating to Genghis Khan. It was captivating to Lord Palmerston, and it has been captivating to American leaders since then also, to believe this is your century in the world. It's over, but we still have 800 military bases around the world. I believe the Ukraine war is likely to be America's Teutoburg Forest defeat. Teutoburg Forest was the loss by Augustus Octavian in AD 9, when the Roman Empire tried to cross the Rhine to the east to take over Germania and was defeated. It didn't end the Roman Empire. It just told them, this is a limit, and you're not going beyond that limit. And the United States is going to learn a limit that NATO doesn't just expand at US will. There are limits to that, and that's the painful process that we're in right now. But it's a secret. Don't tell anyone outside. You're likely to be canceled if you do. So the world changed fundamentally after the Second World War. The United States aspired to be the world leader, but something else happened to bring Adam Smith's forecast to reality, and that was the end of the imperial age. If there is one dimension of imperialism that I think needs to be understood, it is that imperial powers do not educate the natives. And if there's one dimension of economic development that needs to be understood, it is that education is the absolute central feature of development. Because without education, nothing else can happen. And so the European imperial powers left the world illiterate, left their colonies basically illiterate. At the end of the colonial rule, the first thing that happened was mass education. We're still not there yet. But this is the most fundamental breakthrough that happened after World War II, the end of the colonial imperial era. And the United States does its empire in a different way through regime change operations, so it's not exactly the same as the occupation imperialism. But what countries got with their sovereignty was the ability to educate their people. And this has led to economic convergence. Just to show you the gaps, the peak of North Atlantic power was 1950 compared to the rest of the world. 56% of the literate world in 1950, roughly by my calculation, was in the North Atlantic region, meaning Western Europe, the United States, and Canada. Now it's 13% of the literate world. 60% of world output was in the North Atlantic region. Now it's 33% at purchasing power prices. 53% of all urban residents were in the North Atlantic world in 1950. Now it's 14%. The world's converged. Urban, literate, technologies have spread. Adam Smith was right that trade was actually the fundamental carrier of this. It was when China opened up that the acceleration of technological change came so fast to China. It was Japan that invented this process of rapid infusion of technology in the Meiji Restoration in 1868, and then again after World War II in its rebuilding. So we now see that Asia and the North Atlantic regions have crossed paths again using Madison's data updated by IMF data. The North Atlantic was the dominant power until this gap started to close in 1950. And by around 2010, Asia is now larger than the North Atlantic region. This is the real change of the world. We know that the BRICS, even before the recent expansion to 6 more countries, were already larger than the G7. That's a transformed world. And China, of course, overtook the US in GDP measured at purchasing power parity around 2014. But China is still much poorer per capita, maybe a third, but with more than 4 times the population. So this is the reason that China is a larger economy. So I want to argue very briefly that we're in a new age which I call the age of sustainable development. We're there in part because the scale of economic activity and a population 10 times the size of when Thomas Robert Malthus wrote The Principles of Population in 1798, which was then about 900 million people, and today 8 billion people, now has put so much pressure on the physical environment that we are in urgent need of global public response to climate, biodiversity destruction, loss of ecosystem functions, and so forth. And the world adopted goals addressed to this. It's fitfully trying to achieve them. Today at the UN, this very day, is the midpoint review of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're way off track, nice objectives not being achieved, mainly because the United States and other rich countries don't care at all about it. And so the world governance is not organized to achieve these goals at this point. But these goals are the real global goals and needs. So we have a very perilous moment because we have arrived at multipolarity. And as Adam Smith talked about, that balance of awe and equality of force to create justice, that's a delicate, difficult transformation. And just to say, there are several different theories of what's going on right now. Robert Kagan, whom you may know as our chief neocon ideologue and the husband of our acting Deputy Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, believes that American hegemony must rule and will continue to rule. Otherwise, the jungle will grow back, as he says. Wow. Henry Kissinger says that we need a balance of power theory. Balance of power is okay, except it becomes imbalanced, and it's extremely difficult to manage. And when Bismarck was thrown out by Kaiser Wilhelm II, it was the end of Europe's balance of power, and World War I came in response when Bismarck's genius at balancing was lost. John Mearsheimer says we are inevitably in tragedy. That's just the nature of great power politics. Mearsheimer is extremely intelligent, predictive, an extremely nice person, but tragic to read, because he says that conflict is inevitable. I don't buy it. Now, another theory that I read 50 years ago of a wonderful professor of mine also, Charles Kindleberger, said we need a hegemon. So if it's not the US or Britain, it's got to be someone else like China. I don't buy that either, but this is a brilliant book. Boy, it led to a lot of late night discussions over the next 50 years. Graham Allison says, as with Sparta and Athens, we're prone for war, not inevitable, but the war trigger is very high because of the rise of China. And my little contribution is, could we get our heads together and address global public goods and avoid global public bad? So I argue that we need a rational approach, not a tragic approach, and that it is not beyond us to reach the cooperative corner of the prisoner's dilemma. In other words, we can understand the game, we can understand the risks of defection, but we can understand the benefits of cooperation, and so we should be able to reach that cooperative outcome. So I would argue that we need a new geopolitics and a new ethics of sustainable development. I often refer to President Kennedy's inaugural address when he said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." So what hangs in the balance is something extraordinary. We could achieve SDG 1, end poverty, or we could blow up the world. And what is absolutely incredible is how this is in the hands of a very few people. That's what's incredible. And by the way, my takeaway from Oppenheimer was, what a bunch of geniuses that invented the bomb, and what a bunch of dolts who use it or decide about using it. This is our paradox. It took the greatest geniuses of the age to understand nuclear fission and how this could be created, and then it fell into the hands of the everyday person who might not have the imagination to keep us away from global disaster. That's technology, by the way. Technology is often created by geniuses and used by all of us. And that is the real issue that Plato was wondering about already in the Republic 2,350 years ago. How do you make the rulers know what to do? He said you have to raise them from birth for that purpose. So there are crucial public goods at regional and global scale. This is something new. Regional scale, like the European Union or ASEAN or African Union, this is something new, how important this scale is. And global scale is almost unprecedented in human history. We had global trade, we had interconnectedness, but global public goods, not so much. Now we are with the center of global public goods, but institutions in the hands of nation states. Why? Weird. So I believe we need new kinds of global governance and ethics, and I think the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a good place to start. We're in the 75th anniversary this year, and I believe that we can even find a common wisdom, which I call the ABCs of ancient wisdom, Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. They all, by the way, were virtue ethicists. They basically said, cultivate your soul as decent people. It said it in somewhat different ways, but they said it's virtue that gives us the capacity to reach the cooperative solution, whether it's civic virtue, friendship virtue, or the other virtues of sociality. And Aristotle said it's possible because we are zoon politikon. We are political animals. We can be sociable. And so I think finding this commonality of East and West is crucial now, because there actually is a strong commonality of the underlying cultures. This was already pointed out in the observations of the axial age, that these philosophies arose roughly the same time and with roughly the same philosophical underpinnings. And I'll just end with President Kennedy's remarks 60 years ago. We're at the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's remarkable initiative to make peace at the height of the Cold War and to negotiate the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was ratified just these days 60 years ago. Kennedy may well have been killed for it, because rogue elements of the US government hated him for his peace initiatives, and I believe that this is probably what did him in. But he made wonderful observations about peace, and I'll just end with his most beautiful words. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Thank you very much. We are in need of this dialogue for two basic reasons that I'd like to elaborate just briefly. One is we are in a new world in these years, and we're trying to navigate a new world. By that I mean the world that we have thought we knew in some places, a rather naive idea, was a Western-led world. And that was an idea that predominated from roughly 1820 to, I would say, the middle of the 20th century. But the notion of Western-led world continued at least until the end of the 20th century. That world is finished, but we don't know it yet. And it's that ignorance of the end of the Western-led world which is at the heart of the very, very serious tensions between the United States and China, for example, because the Western-led world is finished, the United States doesn't know it, and this means that we have a very deep misunderstanding about the nature of our current global reality. The second reason why we are here is that all together we are wrecking the world, the natural environment. So this is a feature of common humanity for a common global commons, which is the title of our meeting. I'd like to say just a few words about how we got here to give you my perspective. For most of the known history of the last 2 millennia, there was no question that Asia was the center of the world economy because it was well over half of the world population. The nature of life pretty much across the world did not vary so widely. So what we would call per capita incomes were similar. People were small farmers in villages, and this was true whether it was in Western Europe, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was in Chinese villages, whether it was in African villages. The population of the world was, from 1 AD onward, enormous in the Indian subcontinent and in China. And this meant that Asia was the center of gravity. If you would make that calculation of the world economy as well as of the world demography. More than that, China was the dynamic country of the world technology and many civilizational inventions, especially during the Song dynasty from 960 to 1279, till the Mongol conquests. The Song dynasty was a remarkable period of technological fecundity, of economic gain, of multiple fundamental inventions, from the use of the compass for navigation, paper currency, public administration, ocean navigation, movable type printing, and countless other inventions that changed the world fundamentally. So not only was China populous, but China was really dominant. And throughout much of Asia, and especially East Asia, it was China that set the civilizational patterns for what is today's countries of Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. And this civilization, which was a Neo-Confucian civilization, was a remarkable achievement. At this time, we had the high medieval period in Western Europe, and some breakthroughs were starting, a lot of wars, by the way, and but Europe would have looked to any observer at the time as a taker of technology, a receiver of technology, not as a maker or giver of technology. And the technology came from the East in many directions, from the Arab world, from the Indian subcontinent, from China. There are some notable dates. The worst economic policy mistake in human history was made by China in 1434, when the Ming Dynasty decided to end ocean navigation and to scrap the fleet of Admiral Zheng He. Because China would have discovered the New World, it would have discovered the Americas, it would have created a world economy, but China was concerned, the court was concerned about the incursions from the north, not from the gains of ocean navigation, and the great fleet of Admiral Zheng was ended, and those were the end of the ocean navigations. The oceans were given over to the Europeans, actually. This was really one of the most decisive own goals of human history, I have to say. Now, the next date that's important is 1492, because as China vacated the oceans, Portugal and Spain filled the oceans using Chinese technology, by the way, the ocean navigation and the gunpowder, which all had come from China, to begin an age of navigation. Still, without the fortuitous fact that heading west from Europe landed a continent that was not known to the Europeans, history would not have changed all that fundamentally. But the Americas became a resource base for Europe's development for the next 4 centuries, which fundamentally changed the world. And Adam Smith, writing in 1776, said that the 2 most significant events in the history of mankind were the discovery of the Americas by Columbus in 1492 and the discovery of the path around the Cape of Good Hope by Vasco da Gama in 1498. So that was a turning point. Still, Asia was dominant, but this little peninsula on the far west of Eurasia began to explore and ironically conquered the Americas, and that was by virtue of pathogens rather than any dominance, because the Europeans brought smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, and many other diseases, and wiped out the Native American populations by around 95%. and were able to conquer, therefore, two continents of massive resource base. So history began to change. The next date that I would suggest as fundamental is 1776. That's a very interesting year. 4 things happened that year. You know some of them. The most important was James Watt patented the steam engine in that year. A second decisive event was that Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. The third decisive event was that Gibbon published The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And then there was something, a Declaration of Independence of some country also. All happened in that year. But the invention of the steam engine was a turning point as significant as 1434 and 1492, because though the steam engine had been invented by China, it had not been utilized by any scale in China. China had invented the steam engine about 700 years earlier. Watt improved the steam engine with a condenser, and Britain became the first industrial country. And this was very significant because in 1839, my next date, Britain invaded China in the First Opium War. The war fought to make the world safe for opium addiction. Really a sordid act, but just an illustration of what had changed fundamentally in power. From China's dominance, now China was in defeat by the British, by a British expeditionary force from not quite halfway around the world, but was able to defeat the Chinese Ming or Qing, Qing Empire. Of course, I won't go into long history, but the defeats in the 2 Opium Wars was followed by the Taiping Rebellion and by probably the worst civil war perhaps in human history in terms of the human toll in the Taiping Rebellion. And China went from being an absolute great power to being a subjected country and one that faced extreme poverty and hardship later in invasion by many imperial powers along the coast, and then the invasion by Japan starting in 1894, 95, and then in the 20th century. For me, the next turning point is 1947 and 1949, the independence of India and the independence of China. I think there's one key point in history, which is a colonized or imperialized country cannot achieve economic development or success because it is not in the interest of the imperial power to have success in its colonies. The interest of an imperial power is extraction. And so until independence came after this terrible 100 years, China and India were left behind, far behind economic development. So the next turning point in history was the middle of the 20th century when Asia began to recover. And if you look statistically, Asia had been around 60% of world output for 1,800 years roughly, from as much as one can measure this, from 1 AD to roughly 1800 AD. And then by 1950, it had declined to 15%, or perhaps 20% of world output, though the population was still 60%. So the per capita income had collapsed. What we are experiencing now is the recovery of normality, not something outside of human experience, but actually the recovery of normality, because what was abnormal was that a small part of the world the North Atlantic region would so dominate the whole world. And that was by virtue of the technological advances, starting with steam engine, and then the militarization of those technologies, which led to a century of imperial domination by Western countries. This would have lasted longer, but the West fought two disastrous, bloody civil wars, World War I and World War II, and by the end of that period, it was, of course, morally, politically, economically, financially, militarily incapable of empire. And with some lagging battles, the countries found their way to independence. So Asia began to recover dramatically fast. And by around 2010, China was larger than the US economy in absolute size, measured in purchasing power terms. But not surprising, because China is more than 4 times the US population, or was then. Now it's about 4 times the US population. And so naturally it would become a bigger country. 2 implications, and I'll stop here. One is that now that the whole world is industrializing, and we're going to have development everywhere. India was behind China by about 15 or 20 years, but now India is growing faster than China, is likely to continue to do so. Africa is going to grow faster than both India and China in the next 40 years, because it's going to be catching up from farther back. And by the way, Africa right now has the same size population as China and India. All are 1.4 billion. But Africa will be the biggest by mid-century, by far. So if there's an African Union, the African Union will be the most populous part of the world by 2050, by far. And it will be a dynamic part of the world economy also. So we're going to have lots of mindset changes in the years ahead. But there are 2 significant conclusions from this. One is mainly the United States has been shocked at China's rise. And I have to say to my Chinese friends, you didn't ask permission, you know? The US is supposed to be in charge. And now, without US permission, you became so big and powerful, and that is a bit unforgivable in the American mentality. The Americans cannot figure it out because they know what happened to Western values, because it's a very interesting and important and strange story in a way, and it's worth reflecting on. The values that we heard about both Buddhist and Confucian thought clearly find some resonance in Christian thought, especially in gospel teachings of Jesus, and also in Greek thought, because if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, as was seen, you would find some connections that are quite important, actually, and I want to draw them out. But then Western philosophy took an odd turn, or Western thinking took an odd turn, and it's important to understand that change of values that took place starting around 1500 to today, because there really was a change of the Western philosophical approach and a divergence that is, I think, quite harmful in many ways. So if you look at Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, if I might, just very briefly, they're all in deep ways, not the same ways, but deep ways, variants of what can be called virtue ethics. The idea of virtue ethics is that human beings have the potential to do good, not the inevitability of doing good, and that virtues need to be cultivated to bring out the best in human beings. And this is a common idea of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius in the teachings. In Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path, there is the idea of the right view, the right action, the right speech, the right livelihood, and so on, as ways to cultivate the underlying virtues. Aristotle was very, very clear that happiness depends on virtue, but virtue must be cultivated. It cannot be taken for granted. And the main virtues in the Greek thought were virtues of what's called practical wisdom, or phronesis, which was the ability to choose the good over the enticing; temperance, which is moderation, which is a common virtue across all of these philosophies; bravery, which means the ability to defend the good; and justice, the ability to discern the right allocation for each person. And so those became the cardinal virtues in Western thought. But what was key for Aristotle was the idea that being virtuous is a potential of human beings, not an inevitability, because we are all bound by our bodily temptations, by our animal instincts, but also by our reason. So in Western Greek thought, reason was the predominant notion. This is not the same as in Eastern thought, but it comes to some similar points. And Aristotle said one must develop the habits of virtue. In fact, virtue or ethics comes from the word habit in Greek, that you practice, just as we heard, that you become altruistic by practicing altruistic acts. And Aristotle believed in mentorship, in education, in practice, in life experience as being vital. So here is a common basis that merges East and West virtue traditions at a quite deep level. And Christian thought, especially the teachings of Jesus himself as in the Gospels, are not the same basis. It's not exactly virtue ethics, but it is, of course, the virtues that are proposed, and especially also the Confucian golden rule is also Jesus's golden rule, although Jesus states it positively: do to others what you would have them do to you, and love thy neighbor as you love yourself. And that led in the early centuries of Christianity to a tremendous institutional focus of the bishops and the monasteries to care for the poor. And that was a real point, because the Christian communities, the emperors took care of their business and the bishops took care of the poor in a division of responsibility that started around the 4th century AD in the West. Skipping ahead 1,000 years, philosophy changed starting around 1500 in a rather deep way. And while Aristotle taught, for example, that politics is a field of ethics, and Aristotle's book, The Politics, which is the first book of Western political thought, no, let me say it, it's the first book of Western political science is the better way to say it, because Plato had written the Republic a generation earlier. But it's the first book of political science. it is paired with his ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, as two joined volumes, because for Aristotle, ethics and politics were the same. Of course, in 1514, I think it is, Machiavelli wrote a very different political science. He wrote a handbook for the prince, which was about how to maintain power. And political science in the West began to be the science of maintaining or managing power, not the science of producing the good. And in fact, Machiavelli was teaching the prince. He was actually making a job application back to the Medicis because he had been dismissed from the Medicis, wanting a job back that he was advising the Medicis how to hold power in Florence. Later, in the next century, one of the most influential texts in Western cultural history was written by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. And this was written in 1640 as Western science was taking shape. And Hobbes wanted a scientific theory of human beings, but modeled as individual atoms that collide with each other. Because for Hobbes, there was no longer a cultivation of virtue, but rather each individual with insatiable desires. So Hobbes's model of human nature is that it is simply unbounded desire. It can't be taught to moderate desire. It can't be cultivated for virtue. It is individualistic and it is insatiable. And so Hobbes said, unless there is an overarching power, people will kill each other. And so we need a Leviathan, he said, to stop human nature from committing non-stop violence. It was a very pessimistic view of human nature, but notice the main point is no longer was there any idea of developing virtue. That was deemed to be impossible. Instead, one needed institutions to reflect harsh reality. This is the flip of philosophy. It's no longer about cultivating the good. It is about controlling the bad. Then interestingly and importantly, this was amplified at the beginning of the 18th century, first by a very influential public intellectual, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay in London called The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, the most aggressive bees win, but they make the hive powerful and great. And if you try to control the avarice or the vice or the aggression of the bees, the hive actually dies. So this was now a philosophy of empire, that power seeking was good because it would make the society powerful and wealthy and able to dominate over the other bees. So it was taking Hobbes and adding another element, one beehive taking dominance over others. And clearly this was a philosophy that appealed to the emerging British Empire. Then came Adam Smith 6 decades later in 1776, and he said, in agreement with Hobbes and in agreement with Mandeville, that human nature is individualistic, tastes are unbounded, desire is a great motivator, but market forces will tame all of that, because market forces will force a kind of competition that will lead to a socially beneficent outcome. The point is, the Anglo-Saxon philosophy broke free of more than 1,800 years of Western tradition. The Western tradition from Aristotle and Christianity was a tradition of the common good, virtue, and care for the poor. With the rise of the British Empire, the philosophy became the benefits of power as a philosophy. And then even the idea that this would lead to, quote, the common good. But there are two more steps that are important to state. The poor became an enemy because now they were a drag on society. So John Locke, one of our most esteemed philosophers, wanted very harsh treatment for the poor so that they would not be burdens on society. And then came Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote after Adam Smith, one generation later in 1798. And he proposed something even darker, which is that those hives, those different societies, are actually in competition for survival with each other, because there are more people produced than can be supported. And so life is a battle for survival, and trying to help the poor is inevitably to fail because there will just be more poor people. That was his iron law of population. And that led in the next step. Darwin took that idea brilliantly from a scientific point of view to understand natural selection. But the later 19th century philosophers took that idea as a struggle across nations, and that now nations or peoples or races were in the struggle for survival. And this became known as social Darwinism. And the idea was not only should there be no beneficence, if you help your own poor, you will weaken your society compared to others, and indeed you're in a struggle for survival. And this gave rise to the worst crimes of history, because Nazism actually as a philosophy, which it was based on social Darwinist pseudoscience. And this idea, the German people will survive or the Slavic people will survive. And so this is a war even to extermination. Now, this kind of idea led to the worst cruelties, but we are still in a mindset in the Western world where it is competition and struggle that is the absolute underpinning of society. When I studied economics, I was taught about perfect competition. I was never taught even 1 minute about perfect cooperation. The idea doesn't even exist in economics. It's not even developed in one paper that I know of, because the idea of cooperation as a norm doesn't exist. It happened, this notion of letting greed motivate action perhaps did generate the spirit of innovation to some extent. But the way that it was championed and taught, of course, led to the worst excesses. So the world became rich, and those who were rich became devoid of benevolence and compassion. And a terrible writer in the United States who became quite popular, Ayn Rand, a kind of popular philosopher among young people and among many politicians, wrote a famous essay about the virtues of selfishness. So selfishness became the virtue, actually. That's the literal title of an essay. It's unbelievable, and she is championed by many still. These novels are unbearable to read, but they are part of our philosophy. So I went on too long, I know, because the sign told me to stop 5 minutes ago. But so that's not very benevolent of me. But let me say the following. I believe we've had a deviation from the right path in Western civilization. There are roots of Western culture that we can really use to find a path of virtue and politics that is ethical. But the Anglo-Saxon version deeply lost this tradition. And there are many fascinating reasons for this, but it was mainly the rise of power of the British Empire, which was in many ways an extremely nasty empire. And the United States learned everything it knows from the British Empire because it aims to be the continuation of the British Empire after World War II. And this is what needs to end, a world that can return to the common ethical principles of virtue. Now, let me just conclude by saying I am hopeful that this can actually happen. And I think you at the table need to help lead that. And we need to help explain these things. And when President Xi Jinping launched last year the Global Civilizations Initiative, I think that this is actually an important opening that is very positive, because China has said we should go back to our roots of culture to find a way forward, which I very much subscribe to. And the GCI, or Global Civilizations Initiative, is an invitation across civilizational wisdom. And I hosted a meeting in Athens last month, co-hosted with the Academy of Athens, a Aristotle-Confucius symposium on ancient wisdom for modern challenges that brought together Chinese and Western philosophers. We didn't have Buddha properly at the table except one very distinguished Buddhist thinker from Cambodia, but we need more of that. At the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would have a second symposium. This time, I hope it is the Aristotle-Buddha-Confucius Symposium in Shufu, in Shandong province in July. I hope we could participate together in that. We will be back for that. Many philosophers are interested in that. I will be in Shufu in next month for the Nishan Forum, which is also a philosophical forum, but the Shandong government has asked to host the follow-up meeting of the Aristotle-Buddha-Confucius Symposium. And I believe that this idea of East and West deep philosophical traditions, finding the deep humanity that is common across them, is extremely important and powerful and can really contribute to an understanding which right now doesn't exist. And I think the failings of this understanding are overwhelmingly on the Western side, if I may say so, because we are steeped in a philosophy of competition and even war. And this mindset is taken as given, but it is actually a recent phenomenon. It is an imperial phenomenon, and it needs to be put aside. So I believe that this actually can be done. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because I want to talk about net zero by 2050. And first to say how much I admire what Dr. Shaw proposed, and is the book in English also, or in Chinese? Okay, we're going to have to get me an English translation somehow, if we can, but I'm very eager also to read your forthcoming paper. Let me add a couple of things that I think are central, but I think they're already exactly in your climate club idea. It is not possible to reach net zero one country at a time, least of all for an island. We need an interconnected energy system, region by region, because if you are tapping renewable energy, it's intermittent. So it's sunny here or windy here. This needs interconnection. And East Asia should be interconnected in a common grid. There is a mainland China program called GuideCo, Cooperation Organization, that is the China State Grid engineers who are doing analytical work on interconnecting regional grids for Africa, for South America, for North America, for Europe, and for Asia. This is very important work. Taiwan should be connected to the mainland in a power grid. And the mainland should be connected with Mongolia, and it should be connected with the ASEAN countries, and with submarine system. It would be region, the economic powerhouse of the world, rather than a battleground, because this region has everything if it works together. And it could lose everything if it views the region as a battleground. I think everyone in this region can understand this. The only one that does not is my country, actually. But the U.S. needs to be told, let us solve our problems. We know how to discuss. Don't meddle, because you will make a mess. This is actually the truth. This is true about Japan. It's true of zero carbon energy and all the cooperation that would the regional cooperation, the regional structure, and pose and probably roadmaps that show the physical interconnectedness, what technologies, where, as I've been saying, opposite of a plan. It's 80% fossil fuel. What plan is that? Nothing. Please, don't encourage them. So show fantastic work. Sonia and I were just in Beijing with them a couple of days ago. We'll come back for a meeting that they're hosting on September 26th for a worldwide meeting on energy interconnections. I think that this is really absolutely at the core. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's absolutely the way forward. And in that polycentric world, there's a concept which I find very useful. It's a concept adopted by the European Union, but a concept that actually started with the Roman Catholic Church, and that is the concept of subsidiarity, which is that we need governance at all levels. So we need global governance, regional governance, national governance, local governance. You put each problem at the lowest level possible, closest to the people, where it can be solved, but not below the level at which it can be solved. So the power grid cannot be solved at the national level. It must be solved at the regional level. The targets for decarbonization must be solved at the global level, and so forth. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we have this multiple levels. We have global governance. We have a global government that can do certain things and not other things. We have regional government. We have national government. We have local.
Is there any hope that the U.S. and Ukraine are going to be trying to negotiate for some sort of peace agreement with Russia?
This is, Kim, not unlike the virus story in that the government lies relentlessly about why we are in this war, what's happening in the war, and therefore what is going to happen. The biggest lie is where this war came from. And I have a view that is deeply founded, I'm going to say, because I know a lot about this over the past 30 years. This is a war, in my view, that arose because the U.S. rather pig-headedly, in other words, relentlessly, stubbornly insisted on pushing NATO farther to the east every step of the way. And the Russians kept saying, don't expand NATO towards us. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that to Ukraine. We don't want your military on our border. Do you get it? And the United States said, what? We don't hear you. No, don't worry. We're peace-loving. We love you. We want to destroy you. We want to decolonize you. We want to break you up. We want to do all sorts. But we love you. And we never go to war except in bombing Belgrade for 7 straight weeks. And oh, yeah, and Afghanistan we occupied for 15 years as NATO. And the Iraq war was unprovoked. And yeah, we tried to overthrow your ally Assad with the CIA regime change operation. And oh yeah, NATO took out Gaddafi. And yeah, we are placing missiles nearby you in Poland and Romania because we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. But we're peace-loving, and of course we're going to move NATO right up to your 2,300-kilometer border, and not just in Ukraine, but we're going to do it in Georgia. Fascinating, by the way. People, please take out a map and look up Georgia, not the one next to Florida, but Georgia in the Black Sea, on the eastern boundary of the Black Sea, because that country is not a North Atlantic country. So Why would it ever be in NATO? And yet the United States wants to push NATO to Georgia. And if you look at a map, I can explain in 30 seconds why that is, because the intention of the United States is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia creates an encirclement. And Russia's naval fleet, the Black Sea Warm Water Naval Fleet, is in Sevastopol, Crimea. And it's been there, by the way, since 1783. And there was already one major war in the 19th century between 1853 and 1856, where the British had the idea, get rid of that naval fleet. And in the late 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the same idea of surround Russia by getting Ukraine into the Western camp and actually into NATO. And then Russia ceases to be a major power, is their theory. Well, to make a long story short, this is the major reason for this war, and we've never been told the truth about it. And that is really devastating. Second, closely related issue is that in February 2014, the US conspired to overthrow the government of Ukraine, and it did so. That's not a good move. If you're trying to push NATO and there's a president named Viktor Yanukovych who wanted neutrality, and you get together with forces inside the country and you support the overthrow of Yanukovych, the violent overthrow, not a good look. That's when this war started in February 2014. And then if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening repeated mantra of the US government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then, it started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the US poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing, because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, have been part of this story since 2014, and really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well, because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Nuland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the US pushed the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Nuland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney Bush days, and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the US government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that, said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, oh, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliance is? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the US leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you know, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of NATO himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying, and yeah, NATO has nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia and the rest of Ukraine, you know, then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. They've cut them off from the Baltic Sea with Finland.
These are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game?
Yeah.
It was a board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing Risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing could stop us. We take over all of North America. Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads. And they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me, but the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
Well, let me just say the kinds of things that should be done, in my opinion, are things like the Belt and Road Initiative of China, because the Chinese government recognized that for China's own well-being, but also the well-being of its neighbors, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth, and countries even farther afield, all economies need modern infrastructure. And modern infrastructure means access to high quality electricity, especially zero carbon energy now, to fast rail, to fiber, 5G networks, and so forth. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is in its 10th year, uses especially finance from China, from the China Development Bank and other institutions, to help finance the spread of infrastructure across Eurasia and across the sea routes, also connecting Africa and South America and East Asia. So that's a very good example. It's pragmatic, it's investment oriented, it doesn't just talk the talk, it actually provides the financing and provides the technology. I wish the rich countries in the West were doing this. They are the former colonial powers. They behaved badly when they were the colonial powers, and they're not behaving very well as the post-colonial powers. Right. They're not really stepping up to their responsibility.
Right, because I was just in China like for 2 months, and I think it really strengthens the businesses of carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutralization by 2050. But I feel like the United States haven't done enough of promoting this ideology of carbon neutrality. So how, as citizens ourselves, can push for those changes?
It's interesting. In the United States, most people know that climate change is a very serious crisis, and we just had the devastating fires in Hawaii to show how tragic this climate change is. We're in the hottest period in not only recorded history, but in human history for the last 125,000 years. The month of July was probably the single hottest month ever that humanity has experienced. Certainly that's true during the period of recorded temperatures. So we should be doing much more. And the American people know this. And certain things are happening, of course. There's investment in green energy in a lot of places. There's investment in the conversion of the auto industry to electric vehicles, which is part of the solution. But at the national level, there was a piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very strange name for legislation which is mainly centered on the energy transformation, and it gives tax breaks for green energy. But what it doesn't do is make a national plan. There is no national plan. It doesn't make a national plan because in American politics, the power of the fossil fuel lobby, big oil and big coal, is so strong that politicians don't tell the truth to their own constituents, and they act on behalf of their lobbies who pay for their campaigns rather than on behalf of the American people. In the United States Senate, in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the chairman, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is notorious for being the front for the big oil lobby. And he himself has family wealth tied up in 2 coal companies. So
Right.
I regard that as corruption, but in the American system, it's legal corruption, or seems to be legal, but it's corruption not nonetheless. If you're told that in a country that hasn't taken a clear plan for decarbonization has senior officials who own coal companies, you'd say, well, of course, that's just political corruption. But unfortunately, that's how the United States works. So the American people are saying more and more, we're disgusted with the political system. It's all about money. It's all about the reelection of these corrupt politicians. And
Right.
I think that the more we clarify how broken this is, the farther we're going to get. But of course, at substantive levels, we need a plan of action to decarbonize by 2050 that is not only at the state level, because many states have such plans taking shape, but at the federal level. And one of the main lessons of what's happening right now is that there are more projects in more projects in wind and solar
Yep.
than can be put onto the grid, because the real breakdown is the transmission system. But that's where federal investment and a federal plan is needed. And we don't have that because of all the political problems that I talked about.
And I think that America's structure is so like money based, money focused, that it comes before the mutual benefits that all the human can get. It's
That's
always
exactly right.
yeah,
It's
always yeah.
it's not based on the common good. It's based on the special interest.
Right, it's always money, money, money. And then I want to touch on this is that we all know that Japanese is going to have a nuclear wastewater dumps. So what are some actions that United Nations would do to counter this type of behavior?
Well, on the specifics on Japan, I can't really comment because I haven't studied the scientific arguments on both sides. And in general, on technical arguments, I tend to listen to the range of experts and ask their opinion. So I would think at a minimum what the UN should be doing, and maybe it is, and I'm just not involved at all in it, is looking at through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is based in Vienna, at this question of the wastewater from Fukushima and what should be done about it, because that's a technical issue that should not be any individual government's authority. The UN should weigh in, especially at the technical level. But in general, we have some pretty clear needs that are urgent, whether it's the decarbonization or protecting the ecosystems from pollution or from over harvesting or from waste. And we need technical plans of action. But that planning mechanism is hard work. And it's hard work for the political reason of keeping it free from corruption. And it's hard work at the technical level because a lot of technical issues are raised. And so countries need effective planning ministries. China has the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, which does a lot of the technical planning. And the United States doesn't have a planning ministry. So we don't make plans because we don't have a ministry of planning or a ministry of economy or a planning agency. In the US lexicon, planning is a bad idea. But, you know, for certain things, I am happy that planning is done within private businesses, but for other things, I want the planning to be done by government. And in every sphere of the economy, planning is essential. It's just that sometimes it's not a government function, sometimes it's a private sector function.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the United States government needs to go through a really big structural change. And in that, I think the driving forces are the Gen Z and Gen Alpha people coming up. But right now, I think we lack guidance. So what are some advices that you would guide, like some advices that you would give us to start with?
Well, that's a really very interesting and deep question because let me just say that our Constitution was drafted in 1787. Of course, it's had some amendments since then, but basically it's the same structure that was decided in 1787. And it's out of date. It doesn't have the substantive principles that are needed for the modern period, and it does not enable the strong planning or environmental protection or assurance of economic rights for the people. So it's really an out of date structure in many, many ways. At the same time, it has been deeply damaged by corruption, by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the U.S. system because otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And yeah, I think currently another problem with the U.S. is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. Like the counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States. So,
excellent point. Basically, there are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States. Because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide. They want their benefits without saying, you see, I run the government. So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually. And so it takes some effort, but as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University working together, discussing and so forth, somehow making such projects both the economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather than to really educate them.
Yeah, and the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight, because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future, and we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. Don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world.